Thank you. What I'd like to do is to take this opportunity to explore how some of my recent work on remaking participation might contribute and relate to the citizen sciences. And what I want to do is very, very briefly show how a more constructivist science and technology studies perspective offers opportunities for rethinking participation and citizen science itself. And then I want to provide a couple of very quick examples of what this might look like in practice. So this work, I've been doing this work on remaking participation with Matthew Kearns, and in developing a constructivist perspective, it kind of reveals a more dominant way, a more dominant approach in which we've thought about participation over the years, including in the citizen sciences. So we tend to think of participation in publics here as being pre-given, specific, ready-made, and perhaps defined by method. This is what we talked about earlier in terms of having very specific definitions of what something like citizen science is. We tend to think of participation happening in discrete, isolated cases or events, or say citizen science projects. We tend to think about the qualities of participation in very narrow terms, with quite narrow metrics of success, often applied after the event. Things like inclusion, representativeness, knowledge gain, impact on policy. And the institutional challenge, or the problem of participation, is often framed as a problem of extension, trying to extend the space of participation to include all so-called relevant actors, the burden of participation being placed on the public. So from an alternative constructivist or practice-oriented perspective, as Jennifer put really well, this sees participations in publics as being emergent, experimental, co-produced through practice. Participation isn't just specific things happening in isolated events. It's diverse. It's happening in diverse interrelated systems and ecologies of participation. When we think about the qualities of participation, we see that participation in citizen science projects are multiply productive. We can't predict what those productivities and effects are, and they're going to be good and bad. And this perspective says, well, let's try and anticipate and care for things like exclusions, downsides, and side effects. And finally, the institutional challenge is kind of flipped round. It becomes a challenge of institutions and others' powers responding to the multiple forms of public relevance and participation that are kind of going on out there and holding themselves up to challenge. I can only talk in this very brief time about this second point and how this idea of taking forward a more plural approach, we've taken this forward in my research group, the Science, Society and Sustainability group at UEA. So I've been involved in a project that's been mapping the citizen sciences around disaster risk reduction. This is a project led by Jenny Barclay at UEA. And what we've done is to try and map citizen science globally around disaster risk reduction. But as you can see from this definition, we took quite a broad definition of what citizen science might be. And it's this focus on new knowledge for disaster risk reduction, which really opens up the scope here. So in this mapping, this picked up things like citizen science projects that are science-led, say measuring or monitoring volcanoes, but also forms of public knowing, for example, around volcanic and risks and hazards that include things like oral histories, local narratives, storytelling, vernacular knowledges, experience of local communities, things, knowledge making that wouldn't even be considered as being citizen science by the people involved in those projects. Another thing that I've been doing over the last few years to develop this more plural perspective, this mapping approach that we did in disaster risk reduction on citizen science these methods have been developed by my team around the UK energy system. And what we've been doing is to try and map the very diverse ways in which people are engaging with energy and climate change and transitions to net zero in our work on the UK Energy Research Centre. And we're currently taking this forward, these mapping approaches, to map diverse plural ways in which people are engaging with energy and net zero transitions, through setting up now over the next 5 years, running a societal engagement observatory, and an observatory for societal engagement with energy and net zero transitions. So this isn't looking out into into space at the stars, it's looking out to society and the many different ways in which people are engaging across the whole system, so to speak. Policymakers, what do they think about citizen science and how we define it? we've got a very broad definition of what we take participation and engagement to be here, and Policymakers have been very interested. In fact, they were involved in co-producing this design for a new observatory in this space over the last couple of years, people from industry, across government, and also civil society organizations. What the observatory is doing, it has three interlinked parts. The first part is about mapping and monitoring diverse forms of societal engagement with energy and net zero transitions that are on an ongoing basis through digital methods, using case study approaches, and also crowdsourcing. And here we're really trying to capture the diverse forms of engagement that are going on and the knowledge, knowings, and actions that are associated with those. And so this is relates and feeds into another strand, which is around networking, bringing actors together, stakeholders, to reflect, learn from, and build connections based on that kind of social intelligence coming from the mapping. But the important part of the observatory is to kind of put this new evidence and this kind of more plural forms of evidence about participation in publics to work through translating it for responsible innovation and just transitions. And here we're doing a number of things, but I think a really exciting thing for us is to do what we're calling translation experiments, taking these new forms of plural forms of evidence about citizen science and other forms of participation and taking it into policy making with decision makers in bays, into innovation processes around smart technologies, and also to try and think about shaping new forms of democracy and engagement in relation to things like citizens' assemblies. So this observatory is kind of an engagement in itself. I think I would suggest it's linking back to what you were saying, Jess, earlier. It's potentially a new institutional architecture or a set of infrastructures for participation and citizen science. And it very much comes from this second point that I made earlier about, not just thinking about involving or inviting people into particular engagement processes, but to map diversities of participation, engagement, and citizen science, and then put that to work. Thank you.